and slightly more dark, and they can do that quite easily. I don't think that lends to Smith's skills as an actor as much, so it's more noticeable with him. Where with the others, it's like they're making an acting choice, where with Smith it's just like, this is the 15th day of a 16-hour day of his 10th day working in a role, and he's probably just feeling really tired right now. If we move on to, we've already mentioned him a bit, Chris, we talk about John Hurt, because it was not part of the plan. He was parachuted in, and also that he was seen after the fact as being a metaphorical avatar for the old school fan in this episode.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, it is interesting that he is sort of more like a classic Doctor. He does get a little bit snarky about, is there a lot of kissing in the future? Why are you all so young? Why are you pointing a sonic screwdrivers like weapons? That kind of thing. But it's just interesting that he's the one who doesn't want to call himself the Doctor. If he's the more traditional Doctor, and obviously that's part of the arc of the episode, that it's just interesting that he doesn't want to be the one who calls himself the Doctor. It's also interesting, as I watched it this time, that it stood out where he says, what is it about you that makes you ashamed of being a grown-up? And I'm remembering, of course, the classic line from the Fourth Doctor of,
Doctor, you're being childish.
Well, of course I am. There's no point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes.
So how much he is like the classic Doctors versus he's obviously a battle-hardened kind of warrior who's kind of thrown into this role of, it's just interesting to think like how the character is like the classic Doctors, but also is very much his own kind of thing, and he doesn't even want to be called the Doctor.
That's an interesting point. And it takes the younger, modern Doctors to almost bestow the honorific back onto him. Yes, we're newer and younger, but we don't think that makes us better. You are us and we are you.
Yeah, he really is a stand-in where he is saying things like, timey-wimey, can't you just speak like adults? Can you speak without flapping your hands, around? Yes, no. Because, part of that it was a commentary on Matt, because Matt tends to be very visual and physical and flailing around as he speaks. But, yeah, I had not thought of it before, but it really is a good metaphor. And also, I think a little bit, in a weird way, it even talks about the way society has changed. I don't think that Moffat meant it in terms of a main text thing, but there's a little subtext, whether it was inadvertent or not, that just in terms of the way people have matured and the way things have changed. If you think about it, we saw William Hartnell as being a very old, doddering, ancient man, and he was in his 50s. Peter Capaldi came in, a year later, and he was the same age as Hartnell, and he's, running up and down corridors and doing all this stuff, and, at 55, 57, still being very spry and physical. And if you think about it, back in the day, people aged much earlier. If you look at pictures of people who were in their 40s and 50s, and they look like, we would think of like 80s and 90s. Nobody would have thought of like a 70-year-old, almost 80-year-old Mick Jagger on stage cavorting around and dancing and this and that. So I think part of it is too that it's sort of that societal hurt is much more of the old school. I am of this age, therefore I am old and mature and I can't do these things, as compared to the other two who, granted, were younger at the time. Matt was in his 30s and Tennant was in his 40s. It was a much more youthful mindset in general, even though their doctors are older. So I think a little bit is a shift, just how society goes. Because Moffat and I are about the same age. He also is not, about to be tottered off to the old age home, and he's 60-something. So I think a lot of it is just that, too, just like how society changes and how people change, how looking at people has changed and maturity, as it were, has changed. People who are in their 60s now are still, they're acting the way people in their 30s, 40s would have done even 20, 30 years ago, and, go back to 1963 and forget it.
The whole thing about John Hurt being the avatar for the old fan is actually something that was initially pointed out to me by one of our regular guests, Emma, who was where you were, Chris, that weekend. She was in that movie theatre. She was at the convention a day later. She can back up what you said about when Tom Baker and Capaldi appeared on screen in the episodes, and she was like, oh, he's the old fan. And you see it with the assumption that 10, 11 are companions because of the age. Am I having a midlife crisis? The sonic screwdrivers are scientific objects, not water pistols, the whole timey-wimey thing. As a point, it's kind of maybe the darkest part of the episode when 3 doctors are locked in the tower and 10 and 11 are arguing about 11 has, well, it's up to you whether you think he has forgotten or is pretending to forget how many children died on Gallifrey when he wiped it out, and 10 remembers, and 10's arguing with 11 about how can you not remember. And John Hurt looks at them with a measure of confusion and disgust and just says, I don't know either of you. That's definitely the old school fan who's seen the show since Dave's brought it back, kind of hashtag not my doctor kind of thing. Like, I don't even know who you are anymore. But this episode, he's not the lead, but in a way, John Hurt's, like, the War Doctor is the protagonist of this episode. It is his story, and I'm sure it was intended to be Eccleston's story. It's like Killmonger in Black Panther or Iago in Othello. He's not the lead, but he is the protagonist of the story. It's his story. The story's about redeeming the War Doctor, which in turn is about redeeming the Doctor, because I remember there's a joke online about in this episode of Russell T throwing like script pages out of a window, crying, saying it was all for nothing because he totally undid the Time War, which kind of was the solid thing running through the entire modern version of the Doctor. And I think this might have been when you were there, Chris, when Moffat was speaking about this at that convention the day later, where he just said he didn't believe a Doctor would ever do that, even though it's canon. But Moffat's version, how Moffat sees the Doctor, I mean, you could argue it's slightly childish. It's like it's standard. There's a stand view of a character, just like, no, the Doctor wouldn't do that, even though it's canon that they did.
I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously it was very important from a story plot point of view when Russell T Davies started the show again, to not have the Time Lords there, to make him the last of the Time Lords, to have him be alone, to not be able to fall back on those crusty old bastards that are back on Gallifrey. But you're right, and Moffat's right in a way when you think that's not really something the Doctor would do. And I feel like this episode kind of deals with that in a way that it shows that the War Doctor, I mean, first of all, you have to make up a completely different Doctor who's willing to do it, who doesn't think he's the Doctor, which is one way of dealing with that problem, but also kind of doing it in a way that it kind of explores the ideas behind what happens when Gallifrey is destroyed. How many children are on Gallifrey? There were things that maybe Russell T Davies didn't quite think through when he came up with this idea originally of how many people really were on Gallifrey and how many basically were destroyed in this moment of time that the Doctor caused. But honestly, that wasn't something that Russell T Davies wanted to address or deal with. That wasn't as interesting to him, and it is interesting to Moffat. So it's definitely a look at how the two different writers think about stories and how they address some of the details in the stories that they write, whether they've thought about all the implications or whether it's more important to just tell a great story that has a good character arc and that kind of thing. So it's just two different ways. Moffat, I think, thinks about everything in a way that he almost overthinks everything. And that, I think, has been the one criticism that you could make of his writing is that he kind of tries to think of all the permutations, tries to shut them all down, and sometimes that leads to a lot of expository dialogue or other things that maybe people are not as into as they were when they were watching more of the Russell T Davies era.
And I was going to say that I think when Russ was first starting out, the fact that the Doctor suddenly did have this like heavy angst and this trauma on him worked really well, because it was a way of, Rose as the audience surrogate finding out these things and being able to like sort of bring him out and sort of bringing him back to being somebody who was more joyful, who was having more fun, especially for those of us who are old fans who remember the Tom Baker days or the Sylvester McCoy days or what have you, where there was some joy and light. I know for a fact, a friend of mine who's a writer whose name I will not mention, but they told me that because they at least were on spec for doing scripts in season 5, one of the first things that came out of Moffat's mouth when they had kind of like writers' meetings was we're taking the angst and throwing it out the window. That's not the exact quote, but it was something that he felt like that whole thing had been played out. And I think Moffat, being Moffat, doesn't like that kind of a constant, heavy emotional thing. He wanted to have some lightness in the show again, which is why 11 is the way he is. And I think this was his way of sort of like finally taking that baggage and saying, no, it's gone. So at least for the rest of his tenure, he didn't have to worry about that particular thing, especially since he clearly did not like, the Doctor would not have done that. And I think, just not in a judgment way, but I think Russell and Moffat are also very different people. Russell at that time was somebody, he was married, but no children, whereas Moffat had kids, young kids at the time. I think he was looking at it more from the perspective of a dad, which is why, if you look at especially all of Moffat's run, there's always like a focus on the children and parenting and how kids react to the Doctor, whereas Russell's point of view was very different because he's a different person, and there's nothing wrong with it. Just two different ways of seeing it. So I think for Moffat, especially, the thinking of the Doctor, who's this hero, suddenly, being genocidal and killing, whatever the number is that gets thrown up, the number of people died. He's including the kids. That's why we see the children specifically running through the streets of Arcadia and, being traumatized, etc. And at one point there's one shot of like a stuffed animal on the floor. And I think he's very much thinking as a parent and how these things, the trauma that children would go through. And he wants to make sure the Doctor is somebody that children are not afraid of, that children would not fear because, oh my God, he might blow up my planet. So I think that's kind of rectifying. And to me, it's like funny, but it's also annoying that, as you said, it was all for nothing with RTD, but then what did Chibnall go ahead and do? Not that I'm not going to go on an anti-Chibnall rant, but
we've done that plenty on the shows.
Yeah, in the Timeless Children, what does he do? He basically takes all of Moffat's tenure as from here on, and throws that. But that's something that Doctor Who does a lot. I think they do and they undo. What's happening this year doesn't mean that it's going to be the same or the showrunner is even going to consider it, in 5 years from now. It's always something different.
What we're talking about is two people who both are immensely committed to the show and both love the show equally, but love it in different ways and have different perspectives and see the character in different ways. And so much so that Moffat wanted to be the Doctor, RTD wanted to be the companion. And the children point's a very important point. I know RTD in his first time as showrunner, he gave an episode to Moffat because he said, I think it might have been The Silence in the Library 2-part, or is it another one? There's another. So he gave to Moffat, he said, you've got kids, I don't. You'll be better at writing this.
I was going to say, even going back to, the empty child and the Doctor dances, there's children and there's a parental relationship in there too. So I can see it even that early on. No shade on Russell. It's just Russell's life was different than Moffat's was. So you're going to have different perspectives and people are going to have strengths and certain things that they're going to know better than others. So that makes perfect sense to me.
I always say that the Moffat era has more children in it than maybe the whole history of the rest of the show combined. Like, it seems like there's always either a child that's the focus or in the background. And just to clarify my point from earlier, I'm not saying that, necessarily one showrunner is better than another. They each have their pluses and minuses. Jan puts it very succinctly that one of the reasons why they differ is sort of their different angles and the different ways that they approach things.
And there's nothing to say that RTD 2.0 will be a photocopy of 1.0. He also, because his life has changed in this intervening times. And
he's done so many other amazing, very different shows since then. Hopefully he brings some of that and puts it into Doctor. I mean, not the really scary stuff, but hopefully some of the lessons he's learned from doing those other shows other than Doctor Who and puts them into this new era. And I think that would be really beneficial for the new version of the show that he's trying to come up with.
Yeah, I think also, just people in general. It's 20 odd years later, since, Russell's inception of.
We're recording 18 years to the day that Rose debuted on screens.
Yeah, and then if you think, you give him a year or two because he was developing the show for a couple of years before that, he's a different person than he was 18, 20, 25 years ago. We all are. And his life experiences have changed, and he lost a partner. He's seen a lot of changes in the world, this and that. So I think his point of view will change. And I don't expect this new era to be exactly. If it is, that would be very sad because that would say that Russell has learned nothing in 20 years and he's still the same person, which I'm sure is not the case because he has changed. Even when you hear him in interviews, etc.
Jan, is there any additional observations that just stuff that we missed from this?
For me, one of the observations is I really like, in general, I'm a very big fan of the modern unit. The whole point about Kate Stewart is Kate is a scientist. She even says, I'm the chief science officer when she sees the Doctor again in Trafalgar Square. And she's always been science lead. So I like the fact that even though she's thinking about blowing up London to stop the Saigon invasion that's going on there, even if she's fighting a war through peace, she's still trying to